All right, we've got folks still signing in, or logging in rather. So while people are logging in, please do sign in the chat box. All right, so before we finish up chapter 12 today and hopefully get a little bit into chapter 13, are there no sociology classes this summer? I thought I was teaching a section this summer. Let me see what I can find on that. You guys should see my second screen here. If that's not the case, you guys can let me know. My internet connection is pretty slow today as well, so hopefully I don't have any connectivity issues. I've been having some internet slowness all morning. While we're waiting on that page to load, I did also want to mention that I'm about halfway, a little over halfway grading your guys' second round of essays. I think I've graded everyone through K. So if your last name begins with K or A through K, I think should be graded at this point. And everybody beyond K to Z, I still have to grade. So I'm going to be working on those this afternoon. Let's go ahead and do a course search to see. Someone was asking me if we were offering any sociology sections this summer. If I can get the page to come up, I will run a course search for you guys. I thought I had a section that I was teaching, but I might be mistaken about that. I think summer registration just opened today. Yeah, April 15th. Let's see. Are you guys seeing these search results here on screen? Okay, cool.
Yes.
Yeah, so we do have a few sociology sections being offered this summer. I am teaching, and it looks like our summer classes are going to be live online via Zoom as well, just like we're doing right now. So I am teaching a live online section of the course. I think it was Julia that asked. I'm going to be teaching sociology, a section that starts on June 23rd, as you see here, and it's going to go from June 23rd to August 4th. Yeah. And yes, it is my understanding that our summer classes are going to be live online like we're doing right now. Yeah. And then there are some purely online sections of the course that are being offered by some other instructors here. So yeah, you have some options for sociology this summer. Yeah, but we're doing Zoom this summer as well, as far as I know. I was confused because I saw Room TBA and didn't notice the live online. Yeah, no worries. Yeah, the room will be my office here in my house. Okay, so I'm going to be doing that, and also Rick Dunn is teaching the live online section, and I don't know this Epperson instructor. I think that instructor is new. I haven't met that person yet. So, okay, yeah, so I'm glad I was able to answer that question. Back to announcements. So the fourth quiz was originally going to be due tonight. I think it was tonight that I had it due. And chapter 13 on personality is covered in that quiz as well, and we haven't made it to chapter 13 yet. I hope to get there today. We're a little bit behind schedule at this point, but I went ahead and moved the due date of quiz 4 to Monday the 20th. So if you haven't gotten that done yet, you've got a little grace there. That's going to be due on Monday the 20th. And like I said, as far as the second essay assignment is concerned, I have over half of those graded, and I will be getting the other half graded this afternoon. Essay assignment 3 is due on the 22nd, which is a week from today. I've talked about that essay. I have a suggested topic that relates to mental health treatment, but if you want to do your essay on another topic, you want to run it by me here pretty soon because it's due in a week. But if you have another topic idea, run it by me sooner than later so you can go ahead and get started on that. So your third exam was also due on the 12th. If you haven't done that yet, please go ahead and get that done. I've left it open. I'm going to leave it open for a few more days. But if you haven't gotten the third exam done yet, please do so. Okay. So I hope that doing the live online format this summer doesn't hurt our enrollment numbers. I have 4 sections that I was hoping to teach of various courses, and I was really kind of counting on that to pay the bills this summer. So I hope that we can get good enrollment into our summer sections, and I am teaching this summer. So for those of you who want to take human growth and development or sociology with me, if you have not already, I invite you to come take it with me this summer. CJ says for essay 3, I wanted to do it about groupthink and independent choice. Is that okay? Yeah, great topic. I look forward to reading that. Yeah, go for it. Okay, so let's go ahead and finish up chapter 12. And hopefully we can make our way into chapter 13 a little bit today. I normally have a couple of videos that I play for this last segment of chapter 12, but because we're a little bit behind schedule, I'm going to try to go ahead and get through the rest of chapter 12 as quickly as I can. So I apologize if I seem a little bit rushed, but I am trying to get us caught up here as best I can. All right, let's get these slides pulled up. All right, you guys should see a full screen view of the slides. And if that's not the case, someone can please let me know. And Julia, I just realized that your question to me about sociology this summer was sent privately, so I apologize. I guess I should have waited to answer that until after class.
It's no big deal. I was just, I know what I did wrong when I was looking for the course search, but thank you.
Yeah. Okay, cool. All right, so we left off last time talking about group influence And the next topic that I want to discuss relevant to group influence is the topic of conformity. So conformity involves altering our behavior to match that of those around us, or altering our behavior to match other people's expectations of us. So this is a really powerful social force, and I think a lot of us underestimate just how much most of us are influenced by conformity. Many of us like to think of ourselves as independent free thinkers who are nonconformists, and maybe you are, but I think a lot of us underestimate the degree to which we are all influenced by other people on a daily basis. There are two types of conformity that your textbook talks about and that social psychologists have focused on. So normative influence is the type of conformity that involves matching your behavior to other people because you don't want to look foolish, or you're afraid of looking weird, sticking out like a sore thumb. In other words, you want to be accepted, right? So normative influence is the type of conformity that we engage in when we're seeking acceptance from other people. And there are numerous ways this can manifest, and in some ways more benign than others. A relatively benign example of conformity is the way that people tend to face the same direction in an elevator. If you really want to make other people feel uncomfortable sometimes, you'll probably make yourself feel uncomfortable too if you ever try this experiment. Next time you're in a crowded elevator, hopefully not anytime soon, considering we're under a pandemic right now, but once that's all over with, hopefully that happens sooner than later. Next time you're in a crowded elevator, try facing the opposite direction that everyone else is facing. In other words, you'll be looking at everyone's faces, right? You'll probably feel pretty uncomfortable, and everyone else in the elevator will probably feel pretty uncomfortable as well. I would even be willing to wager that some folks may even turn around and face the same way that you're facing just to avoid the discomfort, right? So nonconformity can cause a lot of discomfort, and this is a relatively benign, humorous example, but you know there are more virulent strains of conformity that can occur. For example, when we're afraid to express a dissenting opinion to go against the group, you know, which we talked about in terms of groupthink. You could think of groupthink as a kind of particularly virulent form of conformity. But this is a relatively humorous example. The other type of conformity is informational influence, which is a type of conformity that occurs when we match our behavior to other people because we assume that others know something that we don't know. So in this example, let's say you're at the food court in the mall, and again, assuming that the pandemic is over and life has gone back to normal, I'm looking forward to just those things that we've taken for granted, you know, like going to the mall and eating at the food court and restaurants, and you know, like I'm really looking forward to life returning to some degree of normalcy. Probably many of you guys can relate to that. But in any case, let's say you're at the food court in the mall, and heading to Mad Max. Yeah, I'm afraid that might be true. I hope it's not, but so in any case, you're at the food court in the mall, and you notice that everybody is running for the doors, right? You don't know what the hell they're running from, but everybody is trying to get the hell out of there as quickly as possible, right? Maybe someone in the mall has a confirmed case of coronavirus, right? And the word has spread, so everybody's trying to get out, right? Everybody's running for the doors. Maybe that's what's going on. Maybe someone has a firearm, right? And people are stampeding out to avoid being shot in a mass shooting, right? Hopefully that's not the case, but you know, it happens. Or maybe someone farted, you know, and it just smells really bad and everyone's trying to get out, right? That'd have to be like the worst fart ever. But whatever is going on, people are trying to get out of there, right? You don't know why, but everyone's trying to get out of the mall. So instead of hanging around to find out what everybody's running from, you know, like you see in this picture here, you know, you go with the crowd and it looks like in this picture they're running from some sort of explosion that you can see off in the distance, smoke rising. But whatever it is that people are running from, you don't know what it is, but you'll find out later, right? You're probably going to get out of there just like everybody else is. So this is informational influence conformity. There's this assumption that other people know something that you don't. There's a funny experiment that it's pretty easy to do if you ever go out with a group of friends in public, again, assuming the pandemic is over. But, next time you're out on a busy street sidewalk with some friends, maybe 3 or 4 of you, everybody just stop and look up into the sky, right? Like you're staring at something in the sky. Just stare at the sky for several minutes, and you might notice that other people around you, strangers that you don't know, start looking up into the sky as well, right? So the assumption is that you have some information and they want to know what it is, right? So why are we looking at the sky? Well, let's find out. Clearly these people know something that we don't, and that's a kind of a humorous example of this as well. So you have normative influence conformity, which involves fitting in, and you have informational influence, which involves the assumption that everybody else knows something that you don't, so you better do what they're doing instead of sticking around to find out. The classic experimental study of conformity was conducted by Solomon Asch back in 1955. This is a really simple little experiment. So Asch got 5 guys together in a room. I'm going to say it was 5. And what you don't know as the research participant is that the other 4 guys in the room are actually confederates of the experimenter, meaning that they're in on the trick, right? And they've been asked by the experimenter to intentionally give a wrong answer when shown this image. Everyone in the room is asked which one of the lines on the left matches the line on the right. And of course, if you have normal vision, it's pretty obvious that it's line 2. But the other 4 guys in the room have been asked by the researcher to intentionally give a wrong answer. And you don't know this, though, right? So when it's your turn to answer, probably you'll be the last person that's called upon. Most of the time, with some exceptions, most of the time research participants would go along with the crowd and give the wrong answer that they knew was wrong, but they didn't want to go against the group, right? So this is the classic example of conformity. And an interesting twist, they did another version of the experiment where they'll have you write down your answer. Everyone else gives their answer out loud, but you write your answer down anonymously. And if you're given the opportunity to write your answer down anonymously, then people will tend to give the correct answer and go against the group. But if you have to answer out loud with everybody else, you have a much higher likelihood of conforming and giving the same wrong answer that everybody else gives. So the Asch is how it's pronounced, conformity experiment was sort of a classic and definitely show up on your final exam. Everything that I'm talking about in this chapter will probably show up on your final, at least one question on each topic, I would say. So when it comes to conformity, ultimately what we're talking about are conformity to social norms, particularly with regard to normative influence. So social norms are expected standards of behavior that are typical in a given situation. So depending on the situation that you're in, you're going to have different standards of behavior, also depending on your social role, right? So for example, if your instructor shows up to class every day wearing a band t-shirt, like a Journey t-shirt, for example, like I'm wearing today, and I wore this on purpose just to give the example. If your instructor shows up to class every day wearing a band t-shirt to lecture instead of formal lecture attire, then you might consider that to be a slight violation of social norms. And sociologists refer to these social norms as folkways, right? So folkways are just minor social norms that if you violate them, people might look at you strangely, but it's not necessarily the end of the world, right? If I wear a Journey t-shirt to class like I'm wearing today, or a Metallica t-shirt, or if I always wear a band t-shirt to class, you guys might find that to be sort of a little odd idiosyncrasy about me, but it's not necessarily a deal breaker, right? Now, on the other hand, if I were to show up to class, raging drunk to give a lecture, then a lot of you guys might have a problem with that, right? I would think that all of you guys would probably have a problem with that, and you'd probably report me to my boss, and and I'd probably lose my job, right? Because that's a violation of social norms that's beyond the boundaries of just a folkway. At that point, you're violating major social norms. You might even call that the violation of a more, right? So a more is a more serious social norm. And if you violate a more, you're definitely likely to face more serious sanctions as a result of that. And the most serious social norms at all are what sociologists and anthropologists refer to as taboos. Does anybody know what a taboo is? Anybody heard that term before?
Something that goes against the grain of society that people think is just not good.
Yeah, if you violate a taboo, you're violating the most serious of all social norms. So you can't get more serious of a social norm violation than a taboo violation. Can anybody think of any taboos? I've got one in mind that is universally condemned, and 99.9% of all cultures that have ever been studied, this one behavior is pretty much universally condemned.
Would incest be one?
Incest is the exact one. Yep. Incest is a universal taboo. It is frowned upon in every single culture, and people who engage in that behavior are looked at as really being deficient morally. And it's against the law in most places as well, too. Incest, definitely. Murder would probably be another one, right? So social norm violations range from things as benign as a professor wearing a band t-shirt to class, or someone committing murder or incest, right? But what they all have in common is that they're violations of expected standards of behavior. The more serious the social norm violation, the more serious the sanction or penalty for that violation is going to be. Hopefully I don't violate too many social norms as your instructor, maybe a handful, but I try to keep it to a minimum. CJ, it wasn't illegal if you were royalty. Yeah, that's a good point, right? And it was seen as almost expected among royalty, right? And that's an interesting exception, because you have these royal families trying to keep their bloodlines pure, right? So I guess in the case of royalty, cousins make dozens, right? The rich normally decide social norms. Yeah, that's a fair point. And that's something that we talk about. The Lannisters send their regards. I love it. Always pay our debts. Yeah, Cersei and Jaime and Lord of the Rings were sort of your classic example of that sort of behavior. Yeah, I love that series. My wife and I just rewatched the entire series over the last couple of weeks, actually. So yeah, it was our second time seeing the series, and it was kind of cool to rewatch it. All right, so compliance is the next concept I want to spend a few minutes on. So compliance involves the honoring of a request, or if someone asks you to do something, you do it. That's compliance. Compliance is following a request, whereas obedience, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, is obeying a command. So compliance relates to requests, obedience relates to commands. And if you want to get someone to follow a request, there are 3 age-old tricks that your textbook talks about that may come in useful in your toolkit. Some of them of questionable ethicality. But ethics aside, some of these tricks have been shown to be useful in some sociological investigations. So we have 3 little tricks to get people to comply with a request. One is the foot in the door technique. The foot in the door technique basically is the idea of warming somebody up. So you give them a small request to begin with. Let's say you want someone to loan you $100, right? Well, you might warm them up by asking if you can borrow $20, right? Once they've done that, that's warmed them up to the idea of loaning something to you, but particularly if you've paid them back the $20, right? So once they've complied with a smaller request, that they might be more likely to oblige a larger request. And that's what's known as the foot in the door technique. The door in the face technique is a technique that that plays upon people's sense of guilt, right? So it's the exact flip, the inverse of the foot in the door technique. So the door in the face technique involves, I'll give you an example. So let's say you've lost your job due to the pandemic, as unfortunately I'm sure many of you have. I'm very thankful that I haven't lost mine. I don't take it for granted whatsoever. But let's say you've lost your job as the result of the pandemic and you're short on your rent for the month. So time to go to grandpa, right, or grandma. So you go to grandma and you say, Grandma, you know, hey, I'm short on my rent. So let's say that the amount that you need to make your rent, let's say you're like $300 short on your rent, and that's the amount that you really need. Well, one way that you might be able to make grandma more likely to loan you the $300 is if you start with a larger request, right? Which you don't expect grandma to be able to fulfill. So let's say you approach grandma and say, hey, grandma, I'm short $500 on my rent. And grandma says, well, I'm on a fixed income. My Social Security, I don't have enough money to cover that. That's just too much. I'm so sorry, sweetie. Right? Kind of sound like Kay Ivey, the governor of Alabama there a little bit. But anyway, you go to grandma, you ask her for the $500, and she's so sorry. She really wishes she had it. She just can't afford to loan you $500. Well, the real amount that you need is $300, right? So you say, oh, I understand, grandma. That's totally understandable. But do you think maybe you'd be able to swing $300, right? So at this point, grandma's already feeling guilty about the fact that she said no to the larger request. And she's going to be more inclined to do something that would help to alleviate a little bit of her guilt, right? So this is a trick that plays on people's guilt. So you say, okay, well, am I teaching you how to con? Maybe. Not that I've ever tried any of these, ever. Or have I? But yeah, so, you know, grandma, you know, can't afford the 500. She's feeling guilty that she said no to the 500. So, you know, well, grandma, could you swing the 300? And grandma might be more likely to loan you the 300 because she's feeling bad about the fact that she couldn't loan you the 500, right? So you're playing on grandma's guilt and sympathies. And even if she can't loan you the full 300, you know, maybe she'll even loan you 100, right? But any amount that she can handle that could help you towards the amount you're trying to raise, so that you're able to get the money together for your rent, right? So yeah, you're welcome, Jacob. I'm here to help. So that's why they call me Tricky Dick, right? That's actually my karaoke stage name, by the way. So if you're ever at a bar and there's karaoke going on and you hear the karaoke announcer call Tricky Dick to the stage, then you can expect to see me on stage very, very soon, right? True story, Dania, very, very true story. I tell no lies. I'm not a crook. All right, so that's the door in the face technique. And the last one, the lowballing technique, is sort of an old trick that's used by car salesmen. And in fact, you guys have probably experienced this. So say you're on a car lot and you test drive a car, and you and the salesperson agree to an amount, let's say $10,000 cash, right? Out the door, all fees and taxes included, $10,000. So the salesperson takes you back to this waiting area where there's a TV and free refreshments. By the way, the free refreshments are a little trick that they use to make you feel indebted to them, right? So they give you some free food and refreshments, and they sit you down in front of a TV. And the salesperson goes, okay, all right, I think we're good to go, but one last thing, I got to go and I got to clear this deal with my sales manager. I got to have my sales manager sign off on it. Ever heard this one before? I got to have my sales manager sign off on it. So you sit there for half an hour, watching TV, drinking free sodas, and then the salesperson comes back and he says, look, man, I batted for you. I tried my best, but my sales manager wouldn't sign off on 10,000, but I can get you out the door for 10.5, right? 500 more than we agreed to, but the sales manager just wouldn't sign off on that price, but I can get you out of here for 10.5, right? Well, at this point, you've put a significant amount of time and effort into this deal. You've test driven the vehicle, you've drank their free soda, you've eaten their free food, you've been at the car dealership for an hour or two, and what they're counting on is that you're not going to walk just over a little piddly $500, right? So that's what they're counting on. Now, I bet if you're in that situation and you actually stick to your guns and say, yeah, okay, I understand. That's totally fine. I hate to hear that. So I'm going to have to, I'm going to have to go elsewhere. Have a nice day. I bet you, if you were to say that, magically the cost of the vehicle would go back down to $10,000. I'm just, yeah. Dania, you had to do that when you sold cars. So that's a real trick, right? I'm not just making that up. Yeah. So, I'm not denigrating you, Dania, as a salesperson, but it's one of the oldest tricks in the book. And if you ever work on a car lot, as Dania has attested to, you will be taught to use it. Yeah. That's how we bought my first car for cheap. LOL. Dania hated having to do this, right? So yeah, I mean, I'm not casting disparagement on anyone. You got to do what you got to do to pay the bills, right? So that's, lowballing is its classic car salesman trick. All right, so the next thing that I want to talk about, I mentioned a few minutes ago, which is the topic of obedience. So obedience is what occurs when someone follows a command. So compliance relates to requests, obedience relates to commands. The classic study of obedience was conducted by Stanley Milgram back in the 1960s, actually. This is a classic. This is one of the most famous experiments in all of psychology, and it's pretty controversial. Some folks say that it was an unethical experiment and it never should have been done. But I think it's a pretty interesting experiment, and I tend to err on the side of being glad that the experiment was done. But some folks say that it was ethically questionable. Okay, so Milgram was interested in the question of what gets people to obey authority figures. As a person of Jewish descent who had family members who died in the Holocaust, Milgram was particularly interested in the question of why the Nazis were successful in Germany. Why did the German people go along with the Nazis? Was it that there was just something inherently evil about the German people, or maybe just obedience to authority is a powerful force that the Germans fell prey to under the Nazis, right? Like the Nazi guards who were on trial during the Nuremberg trials said, I was just following orders, right? So would Americans behave in a similar way? That was Milgram's question that he was asking. Would Americans behave in a similar way if put in a situation where they were told to hurt someone by an authority figure? So how did he set this up? So he recruited his participants to come in, and this was the setup, okay? So the experimenter is the researcher. The person you see there labeled experimenter in this figure, this is the person who was wearing a white lab coat, although the person in this illustration is not wearing a white lab coat. But in the original experiment, the experimenter is wearing a white lab coat, and they're sitting at the desk there, and you play the role of the teacher. So you're sitting there at this shock box, which you see there. So there's this box, this electric panel that has these buttons on it that generate electric shocks. And the other participant in the experiment, so there's you and another participant, and you're selected randomly, so you think, and you're selected to be the teacher, and the other participant is put on the other side of the wall, and they are going to be the learner. And you think you're participating in a study on memory. And you think that you're participating particularly on a study of how electric shock affects memory. So the experimenter gives these memory exercises that they verbally call out. And every time the learner gives a wrong answer on the memory exercise, you as the teacher are instructed to administer an electric shock to the learner who is situated on the other side of the wall, and you can hear them via intercom, right? So there's an intercom system set up so that you can communicate with the learner on the other side of the wall. So every time they give a wrong answer, you press a button on the shock box, and each time they give a wrong answer, the shock increases in voltage. So at one end of the box, the electric shock starts at 15 volts, which is a relatively harmless level of electric shock, and it goes all the way up to 450 volts. It increases in 15-volt increments. So you're there for a while to get all the way up to 450. And every time they give a wrong answer, you increase by 15 volts. Milgram was interested in studying what percentage of his participants would go all the way to 450 volts. Keep in mind that on the other end of the box, next to the 450 volt button, there is a danger button that says dangerous level of shock, right? And keep in mind that every time you deliver a shock to the participant on the other side of the wall, they're connected via intercom, so you can hear them crying out in pain every single time you deliver a shock. And every time you increase the voltage, their cries get louder and more intense, right? And by the end, by 450 volts, it sounds like they're dying and they're begging to be let out of there, right? So this is serious, right? Once you get up to the 400 to 450 volt range, you're potentially killing this person, as far as you know. Now, what you don't, yeah, it's a very shocking experiment. So, and the results were quite shocking as well. So the experimenter, like I said, was interested in finding out how many of his participants would go all the way to 450 volts, shocking the other participant. And before he did the experiment, he did a survey of psychiatrists and psychologists he told them what he was going to do, and he asked them, what percentage of my participants do you expect will go all the way to 450 volts? And the survey results of mental health professionals said, well, you don't expect more than 10% of your participants to go all the way to 450 volts because there are less than 10% of the population that are psychopaths, and only a psychopath would do that, right? Boy, were the experts wrong. The results actually were that 65% to 70% was in that range. I think it was about 70% actually of Milgram's participants went all the way to 450 volts. And as far as they knew, they were delivering a potentially fatal electric shock to the participant on the other side of the wall. Now, what the teacher participant did not know at the time was that the person on the other side of the wall was just an actor, and that the machine didn't do anything at all. There was no there was no electric shock at all being given at all. But the teacher didn't know that, right? They didn't know that the learner was actually an actor and that it was never randomly selected. There was no chance that you were going to be selected as the learner. It was rigged so that you would be selected to be the teacher. So after the experiment was over, they were debriefed and the participants were told, oh, by the way, you didn't hurt anybody. This guy was just an actor. But a lot of folks thought that this experiment never should have been done because it emotionally traumatized the participants, because they thought at the time that they were basically electrocuting somebody to death. They did it, exactly. They chose to do it, right? So I think the more traumatic thing really ultimately was the self-knowledge that you were capable of doing such a thing, right? Yeah, power is intoxicating to many, as CJ said. Yeah, so I think the real ultimately disturbing thing about the experiment was that these research participants had to come to grips with the fact that they would kill somebody if an authority figure ordered them to do so, right? That was the most shocking thing about the experiment. And I think that coming to this knowledge about oneself was disturbing to a lot of folks, because going back to the topic of cognitive dissonance, people don't want to think of themselves as the type of person that would behave that way, right? But they did. 70% of the participants went all the way to 450 volts. And there were various manipulations that Milgram used in the experiment. And one, CJ says, one of the few people who didn't go all the way was an electrician. Yeah, that's it. That's interesting to note. Yeah, because he knew that 450 volts would kill somebody, right? It's interesting to note that Milgram set up a few variations of this experiment. He did one version of the experiment where it was all male participants and another where it was all female. There was no difference between males and females. They both had similar rates of the behavior. So, that was one of those really disconcerting experiments in the history of psychology, and it's considered a classic. And some folks, like I said, say that the experiment never should have been done because it was traumatizing to the participants. I think it was a great experiment. Honestly, I think self-knowledge is a great thing, and I think becoming aware of what you're capable of is good knowledge to have, even if it's disturbing, even if it makes you feel bad about yourself. I personally would rather know the truth about myself and have information that's not flattering about myself than be under delusions about, how good of a person I am, and I would never do something like that, right? But that's just my bias. I don't know what you guys think. Brianna says, absolutely. You can't stop the evil if you aren't aware that you're even capable of it. Precisely. Yep, exactly. So the last topic that I want to talk about in this chapter, and then we'll have a little bit of time to segue into chapter 13, is the topic of bystander apathy. So this is the tendency that a lot of folks have to fail to offer help when help is desperately needed. The classic event that kind of inspired this research was the Kitty Genovese case that happened back in, I want to say it was 1970 or 1969 when this happened. But Kitty Genovese was a young woman who lived in Queens, New York, and she was a cocktail waitress at a bar, one of these bars that's open really late. And I think it might have even been a strip club or something, I'm not sure. But she was a cocktail waitress at this nightclub, and she was on her way home from work, walking home. I think it was 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning when she got off work from the bar, and attractive young woman, walking home by herself in New York City, which was a dangerous place back in the late 60s and 70s before, there was a lot of cleanup that happened in the city of New York in the 90s. But New York has always been a somewhat dangerous place, particularly late at night. But this was before even it was improved, and the city got cleaned up later. So New York used to be a pretty dangerous place. And here you have this young woman walking home from work by herself, and she's on her way to her apartment in Queens, and this random crazy person comes up behind her and stabs her to death in front of about 30 or so witnesses who were all, according to the police reports who took all this information, there were about 30 witnesses who witnessed this murder from their apartment windows. They could see the murder happening right outside their window. And it took place over time. It wasn't just something that happened real quick. It was 2 separate stabbings. So the first stabbing happened when the murderer came up behind her and stabbed her in the back a couple of times, and she screamed really loudly, and her screams kind of alarmed the murderer, and he ran off for a second. And he was going to leave the scene because he was afraid of getting caught. But then once he realized that nobody was coming out to help her, he came back about a minute later as she was staggering to her apartment door. He came back about a minute later and finished her off and stabbed her a few more times and then left again, right? So between the first stabbing and the second stabbing, she is basically staggering and crawling to her apartment building and you've got 30 people witnessing this outside their window, and nobody came outside to help her at all. Even when the mugger had gone away, the stabber had gone away for a minute, nobody came out to help her, and he finished the job, and nobody even called the police until she had already bled to death on the front stoop of the building. So this was a really notorious case that made the newspaper. Here you see a clipping from the newspaper of the day where it says 38 who saw the murder didn't call the police. And this was really a national sensation. How could all of these people witness this poor young woman getting stabbed to death and nobody came out to help her, right? And this became known as the bystander effect. And there have been numerous cases like this over the years where this sort of thing has happened, and people haven't stepped in to help people who are desperately in need of help. So Latané and Darley are a team, I don't know if they still do research, but for Latané and Darley were two social psychologists who did a lot of work in the 70s and 80s on the bystander effect and bystander apathy. And they were inspired by the Kitty Genovese case, and they did a lot of experiments to try to replicate these sort of conditions. And their most famous experiment that they did was known as the smoke-filled room study. So in one variation of the experiment, they had a single lone research participant sit down at a desk and fill out a survey. And as the participant was filling out the survey, they had a smoke machine in the next room over next to the door. And as the person was filling out the survey, smoke started coming out from underneath the door. And when that research participant is alone, the participant almost always got up and said, hey, you know, there's smoke coming from underneath the door to the next room. I think there might be a fire. You might want to check this out, right? So they immediately got up and reported it as soon as they saw smoke coming out from underneath the door. However, they did another variation of the experiment where you were seated next to 4 or 5 other research participants who were Confederates, who were told not to react, not to do anything, right? And they wanted to see how the participant would react when nobody else was stepping in to help, right? So in this situation, when nobody's reacting to the smoke coming out from underneath the door, the participant has a tendency to not report the smoke, because there's this assumption that the other participants are going to step in and report it. One of these other guys will do it, right? So if there are a bunch of people in the room seeing the smoke come out from under the door, then there's a tendency to not report the emergency. But if the participant is by themselves and they see the smoke, then they report the emergency. And Latané and Darley did several experiments kind of similar to this with different variations, and they found basically 4 principles at play that seem to explain the bystander effect. So one is what's called the diffusion of responsibility, which is the first point here. So the diffusion of responsibility means that there's this expectation when there are other folks around that somebody else is going to step in and help, right? So the more witnesses there are, Latané and Darley found, the less likely any one particular witness is to step in and help. So there's good evidence actually that Kitty Genovese would have survived that attack had there only been one witness. And that witness knew that they were the only witness, because they knew nobody else was going to step in and help. You're the only person who can help this poor woman, right? So the more witnesses there are, the less likely any one witness is to step in and help, because the responsibility to help is diffused, if that makes sense. And that's what's known as the diffusion of responsibility, which is the first point. The second point is that often we're afraid of embarrassing ourselves if there actually wasn't truly an emergency, right? So go back to the smoke-filled room study. Participants wouldn't get up and report the smoke coming from under the door when the other participants didn't get up to report the smoke. And this is largely probably due to the fact that they didn't want to embarrass themselves if there really wasn't an emergency going on. Maybe it was just a break room and someone had burned some food, right? And they didn't want to embarrass themselves by getting up and making a big deal out of the smoke when it wasn't really a big deal at all. So this second point applies more to situations where it's ambiguous as to whether or not there's actually an emergency happening. Folks are afraid of embarrassing themselves. And, if it turns out not to be an emergency, well, that's embarrassing, right? In ambiguous situations. The third point is anonymity. So this is another point that applied to the Genovese case. Those witnesses were able to remain anonymous because they were all in their apartments, right? So it was impossible really for Kitty to single out any one particular witness and say, hey, you, please help me, right? They were behind their apartment window. They could remain anonymous. They weren't going to get called out, right? However, Latané and Darley have found in experiments that if you call out a witness, if somebody gets called out, hey, you, help me. If somebody gets called out, usually in most situations, the person will at least attempt to help once their anonymity has been violated, right? But if you can maintain that anonymity, then you're less likely to help. The fourth point involves the danger of helping. And this point also applies to the Kitty Genovese case. So three of these points, all of them but point number 2, apply to the Kitty Genovese case. So in this case, you've got somebody with a knife who has already demonstrated their willingness to harm someone, right? They've already witnessed that they're violent and they're willing to kill, right? So if you're watching all of this from your apartment window where you can remain anonymous and you see this guy with a knife stabbing someone to death, are you really going to put your life in jeopardy against this crazy person who clearly is willing to kill? They've already demonstrated this, right? So, I mean, unless you're a trained martial artist that knows how to disarm someone of a knife, like Jackie Chan or Jet Li or something, right? Or unless you have a firearm that you can use, and firearm is, outweighs a knife like rock, paper, scissors. It makes me, the book 1984, one of my favorite books of all time, actually. Jessica, you raised your hand?
Yeah, I was wondering, there's this thing that people are told, especially like college students, that if you're scared of someone attacking you, or if you're scared of being like assaulted, you don't yell out rape or help, you yell out fire, because people care more if they're in danger than they care that you're in danger. Is that true? Is this why?
I've heard that, yeah, and I think there may be some truth to that. Also, fire is impersonal, right? A rapist or a murderer, that's a personal attacker, and they're probably willing to defend themselves and avoid getting caught, right? So you're probably less likely to get killed helping someone escape from a fire than you are defending someone against a knife-wielding rapist, right? Because the fire is not trying to personally attack you; it's just being a fire. So that makes sense to me. I have heard that before, and it makes perfect sense to me. It's a good point. So yeah, that involves that fourth point. How much harm are we risking by helping this person, right? So you had a perfect storm of events here in the Kitty Genovese case. There were a huge number of witnesses, so you had a massive diffusion of responsibility. You had all of them able to remain anonymous, and there was incredible personal danger for anybody who dared to step in to help, right? So knowing these three things, it would have been surprising if anyone would have stepped in to help. So that's all I have for you guys from chapter 12 on social psychology. We have 20 minutes left, and we are behind schedule. I would let you guys out early, when we finish the chapter, but because we're so behind, almost by a chapter at this point, in the 20 minutes that we have left, I am going to go ahead and introduce some stuff from chapter 13 on personality. So let me go ahead and get those slides pulled up here. So chapter 13 deals with primarily the topic of personality. There's some stuff in the chapter 2 about self-esteem and self-concept and that sort of stuff. And that stuff's worth reading about. I'm not going to include it on the exam. I'm just going to focus on the personality stuff in the chapter because we're behind, and I'm doing sort of an abridged version of chapter 13 to try to help us get caught up a little bit. So I'm going to try to make it through a few slides here on personality today, and we'll finish up chapter 13 on Monday, and then probably midway through that class meeting, we will get into, where's my dog coming in? We will get into chapter 14 on mental illnesses, and we're getting towards the home stretch here. No, stay down. No, I don't need you in my lap right now. Sorry. All right, so when we talk about personality, we're talking about, we all kind of know what we're talking about already when we talk about personality. We're talking about the way that we expect people to behave in given situations. If you know someone relatively well, then you have a sense of their personality. So we all have kind of an intuitive sense of what we're talking about here, but our textbook definition is the characteristic thoughts, emotional responses, and behaviors that are relatively stable within an individual over time and across circumstances. So I'm going to touch on some of the major theories of personality, some of the more well-known theories of personality that I've chosen to highlight out of the chapter. I'm not going to have time to talk about every single theory of personality that's covered in the chapter, but I'm going to touch on some of the ones that are better known, and I think some of the more prominent theories of personality. All right, so any discussion of personality, of course, is incomplete without talking about our buddy Sigmund Freud and the psychodynamic theorists that he influenced. So I've talked a lot about Freud already, and a lot of this is going to be recap, but to talk about Freud's, okay, come on. You can say hi to my class. Okay. So, yeah, come on. Don't get in my face. She's such a pain sometimes. Okay, so when we talk about Freudian theory of personality, ultimately we're talking about, yeah, I know, now she's sneezing on me. Well, we're talking about a theory of personality that is rooted in Freud's. Everything's, I don't know why Siri just went off. I wasn't talking to her. My dog's being a pain in the butt right now. I'm gonna have to put you down. So, all right, bye. That didn't work out. Freud's theory of personality is ultimately rooted in his idea of the unconscious mind and this is rooted in his theory of the unconscious mind and the three structures of the self that we've talked about that relate to Freud's theory, the id, the ego, and the superego. So Freud believed that most of what makes us who we are is located deep below in the subconscious. He saw the self as kind of being like an iceberg, and most of the self is located below the water, like an iceberg. You know, you don't see, but just the very top, which is barely a tiny percentage of the iceberg itself, right? Most of the iceberg is below the water, so to speak. So Freud believed that most of the self, what makes us who we are, is determined by these forces that exist in our subconscious. And the major subconscious component of the self is what Freud referred to as the id. So the id is that that primitive, selfish, animalistic part of the self that is all about seeking pleasure and avoiding pain, and it has no concern for the consequences of our behavior. It's just pure selfish pleasure seeking, right? That's what the id is all about. And he said that is a major part of what drives people. It are these forces from the id that dominate personality that are below the surface. He said there was also a component of the personality called the superego, which is also mostly subconscious. Now, Freud believed that the id was completely subconscious, but the superego, the moralistic part of the self, was partially subconscious. The vast majority of the superego, the part of the self that deals with morality and ethics, is kind of 70% subconscious, and a tiny percentage of it is actually on the surface. But Freud believed that the superego was that part of the self that makes us feel guilty about things and gives us our sense of right and wrong and our sense of ethics. And it's largely the result of standards from society that we've internalized, from our culture and our society. And he said the conscious part of the self, the part that we project to others, is what he called the ego. And the ego is the rational decision maker, but the smallest part of the self. We would like for the ego to have full control over our behavior, but according to Freud, it's actually the tiniest part of the self. That most of the self is primarily irrational and driven by these subconscious impulses that we're mostly unaware of. And the goal of psychotherapy, according to Freud, was to make people more aware of these subconscious parts of ourselves that are driving us that we're not aware of. And the ego, to make the ego stronger and to make us less driven by our ids and our superego, and to give us a better sense of balance. You're about to drive me crazy here. Maybe she needs to go out. I'll let her out in a minute. But so psychotherapy was all about bringing a sense of balance between these three forces of the self. But Freud believed that the ego employs what are called defense mechanisms. Stop. That the ego employs what are called defense mechanisms to keep these unconscious parts of ourselves from rising to the surface, because Freud believed that ultimately this stuff in the subconscious is too scary to face, right? These are parts of ourselves that we don't want to face for whatever reason. I'll give you guys a concrete example of this. This really happened, by the way. And I think Freud was right about some things, although I think a lot of his ideas were kind of out there and kind of quacky. But I think Freud was right about the idea that we often try to hide parts of ourselves from ourselves, right? Here's an example. So a good friend of mine, he's gay, and he was raised by a very conservative religious family. And he's very successful financially, actually. He's a very successful local architect, and he makes more money probably in a month than I make in a year. I mean, he is really doing well for himself financially. Very successful architect, and his family is very proud of him for his career success. But he was raised by a very conservative religious family, and for years and years and years, he would try to conceal the fact that he was gay from everybody, right? And it was kind of obvious to those of us who knew him really well, his closest friends. It was kind of obvious that the dude was in the closet, right? Because you'd just catch him looking a little bit longer at some good-looking guy, right? Like, yeah, you sure about that, man? Just little telltale signs, right? But he was terrified of coming out because he was afraid that his family would disown him because they're highly conservative and religious folks, right? So for years and years, he employed all of these sorts of defense mechanisms to try to avoid admitting that he was gay to himself and to the world, right? So here are some of the common defense mechanisms. You could say that for many years, he was engaged in denial, right? This is refusing to acknowledge his sexual orientation. And you see denial also a lot among substance abuse addicts, right? For those of you who are familiar with the 12 steps and have spent any time in the rooms of 12-step programs, the first step of the 12 steps is to admit your powerlessness over your addiction, right? And the reason for that is so many addicts struggle with denial, you know, this unwillingness to admit that one has an addiction. Well, in my friend's case, his denial was this refusal to admit that he was gay, right? And he also was, and he also used some other of these defense mechanisms that you see here, right? Reaction formation. This is when you try to act the opposite of what you are. So for many, many years, he would try to really display his uber masculinity to everyone, right? He drove, you know, a really, he drove a really loud truck, you know, with loud pipes, you know, and he worked out a lot in the gym, you know, it was very, very buff, right? And he still is, actually, even now since he's come out. But he did a lot of things to try to seem really masculine, right? And he had a really, you know, nice looking girlfriend, for example. And I felt kind of bad for her. But, you know, he was doing all of these things to try to show everybody how masculine and straight he was, right? And not necessarily, and I'm not implying that gender identity and sexual orientation are the same thing, but he was really trying too hard, right? Has anyone ever heard the old Shakespeare quote, "The man doth protest too much," right? That kind of speaks to the idea of reaction formation, which is trying to act like the opposite of what you are. And I'm very happy to report that he did eventually come out. And of course, you know, none of us who are his closest friends were surprised, and we were all very supportive. And I'm also happy to report that his family did not disown him. Now, they aren't particularly happy about it, but they have agreed to just, you know, it's basically, they just don't ever talk about it, right? They're very proud of him for his career accomplishments, but they don't talk about the fact that he's gay, right? It's just sort of something that they never talk about. He never brings his boyfriends around them, and you know, I wish that they would be a little bit more open, but at least they haven't disowned him. So it hasn't been as bad as he thought it was going to be. Can anybody relate to this in any way to these defense mechanisms, not even necessarily with being gay? I mean, maybe you could relate to that, but can anybody relate to you or anyone you know employing these defense mechanisms to hide from some part of oneself? You know anybody? Dania says, denial was a huge part of my life when I was active in addiction. Yeah. Envy Fry says, yep, a lot of those. Brianna relates. Yeah, so I think a lot of us can relate to this Freudian idea of having a part of ourselves that we don't want to face. So I think that's the most powerful part of Freud's ideas. I think Freud was wrong about a lot, but I think the idea of the subconscious and the idea that we're often running from ourselves and trying to not face things about ourselves because they're frightening. I think that's the part of Freud's thinking that rings truest to me and has the most value as a psychotherapist and as a counselor. To me, that's the most valuable part of Freud's theory. The last thing I want to talk about, we have 5 minutes left with regard to Freud, is the idea of his psychosexual stages. And this is where, I start to part ways with Freud a little bit. Like I said, Freud's very much a mixed bag, but Freud believed that human beings developed through actually 5 stages of what he called psychosexual development, as you see here in this slide. And he believed that at different ages of development, gratification, which is a function of the id, but gratification is focused at certain bodily organs. So for example, in the first 2 years of life, the oral stage, as Freud called it, this is the stage where you're feeding from the breast of mom and eventually getting weaned, right? So it's all about the mouth at the oral stage because it's all about the breastfeeding. And then as you get into 18 to 36 months, according to Freud, you enter what he called the anal stage because this is the stage of potty training. So he believed that the anus and digestive functions like peeing and pooping become sort of the focus of life around this age. And then around 3 to 6 years, you enter what he called the phallic stage, which is the stage when little kids discover their private parts and you kind of become obsessed with your private parts and play with them inappropriately, right? And then from age 6 to puberty, Freud said we enter what's called the latency period, where we kind of forget about our sexuality for a little while and we kind of focus on same-sex friendships, like in Little Rascals, where we see the He-Man woman haters, the little boys don't want to have anything to do with the little girls, and the little girls don't want to have anything to do with the little boys. And he said that this is evidence of what he called a latency period, where our sexuality becomes dormant during these years, but then we hit puberty and it all comes flooding back. And after puberty has happened, then we join in the pursuit of adult sexual relationships. And according to Freud, puberty was the end of psychological development, which is really kind of a laughable idea. But you can see the thread that runs through all of these stages is that Freud was very focused on sexuality and sexual development. And there isn't a lot of empirical evidence that Freud's stages of psychosexual development, that there's really much to this idea, right? But Freud believed, it is kind of disturbing, as CJ says. Here's where we realized Freud was into incest and wanted to normalize it, but thankfully failed. Yeah, Freud was kind of a bizarre guy, and he believed that during the phallic stage, for example, that little boys become sexually attracted to their mothers and little girls become sexually attracted to their fathers. He called it the Oedipal complex, which is one of his most notorious parts of his theory. It's Freud. A lot of Freud's ideas around sexuality make people really uncomfortable, understandably, and thankfully, there's not really a lot of evidence that Freud was right about this stuff. Like I said, I think Freud was right about the idea that we have a subconscious, and I think Freud was right about the idea that we often employ defense mechanisms to sort of face things about ourselves that we don't want to face, to not face those things that we don't want to face, rather. But when it comes to sexual development, it's kind of quackery, quite honestly. But Freud believed that you could become fixated at any one of these stages if something went wrong during that stage. So for example, if something went wrong during the oral stage, he believed you could develop what's called an oral fixation, right? Which could manifest as a smoking habit or chewing lots of gum, or maybe having an obsession with breasts or something like that. Or if something went wrong during potty training, during the anal stage, then you could develop what he called an anal retentive personality, which was an overly controlling personality. So he believed that trauma during a particular stage would lead to certain types of what he called fixations that could shape your personality in significant ways, right? So Freud was very much a mixed bag, and that's where we're going to stop today. So we got through Freud and personality, and next time on Monday we will continue our exploration of personality theories with humanistic theories of personality, and we'll get through the rest of this chapter and hopefully get into some mental illnesses as well in chapter 14. So thank you all for great discussion today. I hope everyone is continuing to stay safe and healthy. If you did not sign in today, please do so before you log out. I'll leave the room open for another few seconds for people to do that. Have a great day, Envy. And I'll see you guys on Monday. Have a good day, Jacob.